The first thing to know about how Canadian aid is delivered is that it's delivered through the Canadian International Development Agency, which is what I would refer to as a bureaucracy in a bubble. It's full of hardworking and well-intentioned people, but over the last few decades, the driving force in foreign aid internationally has been almost an international competition to see who can do the best job of meeting the global goal, the goal for developing countries of spending 0.7% of their gross national income on foreign aid. Now that's a laudable goal, it's a good thing, but sometimes when you're driven by a money target, you get more focused on spending money than on how the money is spent. And many times we've seen in recent years that CIDA has struggled with this. It becomes a bureaucracy that is trying to spend money by writing checks to foreign agencies, to the United Nations, to foundations, to get as much money out of the door as possible. And this is where the bubble comes in. Because instead of making these decisions in Africa, decisions about Africa are actually made now in Silicon Valley, at the United Nations in New York, in Geneva and Brussels and London. And our aid officials in Canada are speaking to bureaucrats who think very much like them in all of these places and making important decisions about Africa. So that's been the direction. But the big news in Canada is that in the last few years, there has been a radical new direction in our foreign aid, as there has been a radical new direction in our foreign policy. And I would ask you, Uju, if you can help explain that for folks.
Right. So, of course, there was a change in administration in Canada, something that anybody who works in this area, who is monitoring humanitarian aid, who is monitoring how African nations are relating with Western countries, it's always important to note what happens during a shift in administration or during a change in administration. So I noticed that once the Trudeau administration came into office, there were lots of announcements about different changes that were going to happen, particularly to humanitarian aid, to how Canada deals with foreign aid, to how Canada relates to the African countries and funds different projects. So I noticed, of course, just like probably everyone else who was paying attention, that the Canadian government, first and foremost, took one of the most important funding streams that Canada had going towards African countries, the Muskoka Initiative, which had to do a lot with maternal health and the health of the newborn and the health of pregnant women and so on and so forth, and started to redefine it and change it and change the most important elements of it. We also noticed as well, those of us who were observing, that the Canadian government, the new administration that is, came up with this thing that we're calling the feminist foreign policy, something I must say that I have never seen with any other Western donor, with any other Western country. So this was very new to us. But following the announcement of these different changes, we then noticed what actually it entailed. What does it mean when the Canadian government speaks about foreign policy or the feminist foreign policy, something, again, completely new, completely made up, if you like. But don't forget that they're dealing with Africans. They are dealing with African countries that within their own minds and within their own mindset have their own views and values on the family, their own views and values on motherhood, for example, their own views and values on women in society. The Canadians then came to us with something that had already been preconceived and written up in Western countries, in the minds of feminists, in the heart of the feminist movement that is largely Western, if I could put it that way. But what made it terrible or unfortunate is that it's not only that the Canadian government is bringing in this Western conceived idea or ideal of feminism or their own definition of what feminism is. the Canadian government brought it in with a force of money. So the kind of millions and millions of dollars that the Canadian government was able to put behind this whole agenda, this thing they're calling the feminist foreign policy, and that's exactly how they are dealing with African countries. So imagine the tilt of power going towards the Canadian government that has all the money, has all the control, but also, mind you, as we had mentioned earlier, they had already conceived everything they were going to do in African countries, everything that they think is the best way to proceed with the Muskoka initiative, which was one of Canada's selling points as far as relationship with other countries is concerned. The Canadians were funding, the maternal health. They were helping women who were giving birth to children, giving money to, to causes that would take care of the neonates. But the new Canadian government decided that as part of the maternal health, the Muskoka initiative was going to be something like abortion, and also something like adolescent family planning. This is all language that has come directly from your government's website as far as some of these, agenda would be concerned. So it's how we've seen the Canadian government, how they have dealt with African countries, the Africans themselves. I think it's a little bit confusing because for a lot of these African countries, we have our way of life, we have our, how our society flows. There are gaps, of course, as far as finance is concerned and as far as poverty is widespread, but it doesn't mean that we don't know what it means, to respect motherhood. It doesn't mean that we don't have our own thoughts as to how women are supposed to be the real heart of the home within society. The Africans already have their thoughts and their views and values on these issues, but the Canadian government comes around with the force of money, and they are coming with their ideologies all already made up. This is how you know a donor who doesn't care about what the receiver or the recipient is thinking or how their way of life is. They just come in to impose upon us something that they have already preconceived in Ottawa and in Toronto.
Uju, that's shocking. And from a Canadian perspective, what's most shocking is how blatant we've been about this, how clear we've been in messaging that this is exactly what we're going to do. I remember the statement from then Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland where she talked about feminist international assistance, and she couldn't have been clearer in signaling that from here on in, Canadian foreign aid would be based not on listening mode, but on broadcast mode. Regardless of what a country in Africa might need or want, what we're saying now is what you're going to get from us is abortion. And that's shocking. And we've got hundreds of millions of dollars a year to spend to make sure that that happens. And as we've seen in elections in the West, in Canada and the United States, big budgets can actually help to sway opinions, and they can also help to change how society makes its judgments, how things like the family are seen. And that's precisely what we intend to do in Africa. There was a document that was released at the time of the announcement, these were answers to frequently asked questions, where we made explicit that it's just that kind of influence shaping, that kind of influence operation that we intend to use some of this money for.
Exactly, David. What you've said now about your former foreign minister at the time these announcements were made is quite telling. That's exactly what we saw. We saw a donor coming to African nations to say this is exactly what we are ready to spend on. As you called it, the broadcast mode. They went on the broadcast mode. There's absolutely nothing about them listening or asking the Africans exactly what they think they want or what they need within their societies, of course, which we would know best because we're the ones in those situations. But there was something else I picked up from her statement, the so-called sexual and reproductive health and rights, which she had referenced, talking about the way Canadian funding was now going to be administered and where the funding stream was going to be flowing. The sexual and reproductive health and rights, for anybody who reads some of these UN documents, the resolutions and things that have happened over the last few decades, sexual and reproductive health and rights has now become a signal, a code that really means when you broaden it and open it up and unpack it, it really means all that have to do with abortion and the so-called comprehensive sexuality education and population control in some regards. Sexual and reproductive health and rights has become a real code, and it's something that a lot of Western countries have picked up, and it's really in line with their own ideas and ideologies. But when you come to African countries, that's another ball game. As a matter of fact, many of our African diplomats who work around the United Nations do have a problem with the sexual and reproductive health and rights. Why? Because it's been defined. It's all been defined by Western donors, by Western countries. And how do we then say we have consensus when Western countries are rallying around this particular term that they have come up with to include all of these issues that are actually in line with their own ideologies? So sexual and reproductive health and rights being the core of the funding, the new type of funding that is now being given by the Canadian government, is a real problem. They also mentioned abortion at the time of the announcement. The Canadian government was very keen and very clear to the fact that they are now going to be making all efforts to make sure that abortion is accessible and abortion is abortion is provided in all of these countries where they were funding things. But anybody who also would want to ask the question, abortion is actually not legal in many of the African countries. And it's not legal in many of the African countries, not because these Africans are so backwards and we don't know what abortion is and we cannot go out and get abortion. We all have our parliaments, we have our legislative bodies, we have the executive, and we could go through the entire process of passing a bill, of making it law and getting abortion if we want. But the point of the matter is that in most of the African countries, wherever the poll or the survey has been done, overwhelming majority of people in these African countries are saying no to abortion. The Africans themselves are rejecting abortion from the point of view of their cultural heritage and their cultural beliefs. So imagine that a donor is then coming towards us, like the Canadians, and saying to us, this is now where our funding is going to be centered around the so-called sexual and reproductive health and rights, the abortion access and how accessible abortion is, and the funding of abortion and the lobbying for abortion. You are bringing this to a group of people who already have very strong views as far as society-wide. This is something that is absolutely rejected by most people in society. What are you telling us to say that you are going to be funding this particular issue in all of these African countries, in places where they have other needs, particularly things that have to do with real healthcare, education, infrastructure, all the things that people in various African communities are asking for. And the Canadian government makes an announcement that is all about sexual and reproductive health and rights and the funding of this particular ideological agenda. So it's incredible.
Uju, as you speak, I can feel your indignation and your sense of outrage. And then I reflect on how I would feel if another country said, we're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to, quote unquote, address social norms in Canada, in other words, to change them, and to eliminate the judicial and legal barriers that are the laws that the Canadian people have set up to govern their society. We would be outraged too. We would be indignant too. So I get it.
Exactly. People in Western countries will completely understand, just like you have now, what I'm speaking about. No country should be able to come into another country and make their own dictates, make their own demands, or push the power of their money or their wealth. You had right at the beginning referenced China, and people have seen it in some regards in many countries where they have a lot of dealings with China. This is what we are seeing in African countries. I know that Canada has this almost like a moral high ground where they stand, and the Canadians may not even be able to conceive it within their minds that the Canadian government is then appearing as this neo-colonial master who is coming and making demands and coming and making requests. But that's exactly how it is when you think of the fact that these African countries have rejected some of these ideological points that our Western donors have, and their own priorities and their own agenda. The African countries do not want to have anything to do with any of those things, but simply for the mere fact that we are on a lower ground as far as money is concerned, as far as funding is concerned. It's a horrible thing to see another country coming in and taking control like that, and coming in and pushing their will in that way, and giving nothing but more strength and power to those who are on the margin against the will of the majority of the people. So anyone who is in the West and who understands all about the sovereignty of a nation will understand exactly why I am unhappy about this. And most of people in Africa who know what is going on are actually indignant about it as well. It's a terrible thing and a very unfortunate thing, but that's where the African countries have found themselves, because that's where the Canadian government has now willed to go. The Canadian government is going by ideology, and they are ready to use their money to buy their way, if possible.
You know, no one is suggesting that Canada is using the same kind of violent and illegal means that China sometimes uses in its coercive diplomacy. But the use of money and the power and leverage of money is in many ways the same. And so too is the disrespect that it shows for the partner, the other country. This is coming home.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that is true. Absolutely. So the Canadians, just for some, so that nobody will get me wrong, yes, the Canadians are not doing all the things that China is doing in terms of the abusing of human rights and the rights of the people. But in some ways, it is even more insidious, because if China comes in with all of their tactics and all of their strategies, they're easily recognizable, and people can push back and say, we know what you are trying to do. We have seen you doing it before, But the Canadians are the nice guys, if I can put it that way. Growing up in Nigeria, which is in West Africa, I have always thought about Canada as the nice ones, the kind ones. The Canadians are the humble ones. This is how I have perceived Canada, and this is how a lot of people from the society that I come from, how we have always seen Canada, the ones who would stand and listen, So it is so much more insidious that one who has been perceived as a friend for so many years, all of a sudden then comes back still looking nice, still smiling, but then the difference is that the entire list of things that they want to do and the things that they want to achieve in our countries is now completely different. And the fact that they come with so much money, sometimes it's actually more dangerous than a friend comes to you with something that is ideologically driven, even if they are not being forcefully coercive, as some other people may have been in the past or some other people are now doing. But the Canadian government has, they do have the advantage, the fact that Canada has such a good name right across the continent, and Canada is so well trusted. But unfortunately, their ideology is dangerous for our people, and we are now beginning to see it. It's only been a few years, but already we are seeing in so many places the effects of that.
One of the things that might surprise Canadians when it comes to the delivery of our foreign aid in Africa is that we don't have teams of Canadian aid workers working with African partners. As I said at the outset, a lot of our aid is delivered to Africa via Silicon Valley or New York or London. And Uju, I was wondering if you could say a few words about who our partners are. Who are the people who are getting these checks to carry out the feminist international aid policy that we've so proudly announced?
Right. So a lot of people who are taxpayers in Canada may not in fact realize, as we talk about it, and even people on the African side of things, who exactly is helping Canada to achieve their goals and their so-called feminist foreign policy. It's the third party. One, it's not Canadians. Two, it's not the Africans themselves. Then who's doing it? A lot of this is coming from the United States, it's coming from the United Kingdom. So organizations like Marie Stopes International, a London headquartered organization that is running out of the United Kingdom, is running out of a London office, is actually a major partner to Canada as far as the so-called sexual and reproductive health and rights is concerned. Marie Stopes International, for those who don't know, is this organization that has been so riddled with scandal and by scandal. Here in the United Kingdom, they have had problems with a care commission that regulates organizations like Marie Stopes. They've had their own problems in the UK. They have had problems in different African countries. They have in fact been banned and suspended at different times across the different African countries. And yet, because this is all things happening outside of the Canadian news cycle, it's quite easy for the Canadian taxpayer to miss that an organization like this with such a reputation, with so many problems, they're always on some kind of PR campaign or some kind of PR cleanup activity. Why is it that they are now the recipient of a lot of Canadian funding, a lot of Canadian money, a lot of Canadian dollars? Check out what your government is doing. Marie Stopes International, Pathfinder, which again, they are not a Canadian organization. They are very much involved with all kinds of things that have to do with population control. In fact, it was the other time I realized that Pathfinder International helped the Gates Foundation to roll out one of the major population control campaigns that has been done in Africa in the last couple of years. They helped the Gates Foundation roll out the so-called Cyanide Press, which was invented by Pfizer or which had been put out by Pfizer. But Pathfinder International, anyone who knows Pathfinder and who knows their history will also know that they've been very much involved with the eugenics movement all the way, going all the way back. The Canadian government is cooperating with them and collaborating with them. The Clinton Foundation, again, they are not Canadian very obviously, but they are a partner to the Canadian funding stream or the Canadian International Development Agency. People should know that Canada coming into African countries and doing aid, I know it sounds nice, and anyone who is trying to imagine it would just imagine some, good Canadians going out, setting up schools, building, nice facilities for Africans in different communities. But it's actually not like that. This is all Canadian money going into the pockets of corporate organizations. Yes, they are in fact corporate organizations. Some of these London-based and American-based organizations. That's how aid, that's the cold truth about aid. It's money going into the pockets of people that are already wealthy. It's for some of them, it's actually like a new market that is starting off and the Canadian money flowing right through and they going out to Africa and deciding what needs doing or what they want to do. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the African organizations. So meanwhile, the African organizations themselves, they are not involved directly in any way. If there is any African organizations involved, they are only like a tertiary provider of any of the aid, if is even the case. The Canadians themselves may only just be running a small office or a small outfit in the African capital, but the people who achieve or who go out to carry out these so-called feminist foreign policies Western organizations, mostly American, British, and some other European organizations. So it's money flowing from the Canadians to those who are already very wealthy, putting their CEOs and the presidents of these organizations into six-figure salaries. They have executives who are living really well, and all on the force of the fact that they are doing work, they are doing good work in Africa on behalf of the Canadians. So that's an area I think the Canadians must and should ask for transparency on who gets the Canadian money, who is using the Canadian money, who is living on the Canadian money. Some of those people, you see them at African capitals, they are living in really nice hotels. At one time, in fact, I remember just something personal that I had been doing some work in an African country, and I happened to have something to do at the Hilton Hotel at one of these African capitals that I will not be naming. It was shocking to me, the number of Western donor organization staff who were living, they were actually living at this Hilton, this African capital. So it's the force of the money and the power of the money, and all of this money, mind you, is all taxpayer money. And the people who have given it have no idea that this is exactly how their money is rolled out.
Uju, you mentioned in your response, you used the term population control. And that reminds us that while Canada's feminist foreign policy and our feminist international assistance may be something new, the population control movement is not new. It has its roots in the first half of the 20th century, in misguided progressive movements. As you reminded us, it has its roots in various campaigns that were associated with eugenics. It saw major foundations in the 50s and 60s obsessed with bringing the gospel of population control to China and India and Africa. But the view seemed to be that you could solve the problems of China, India, and Africa if there were a lot fewer Chinese, Indians, and Africans. Does that thinking still exist?
Oh, in fact, I think that thinking is the core of many of the projects that are being done. This is eugenics and population control that we have long since meant to have been rejected. All of these ideas, people agree that you do not eliminate the poor, you do not eliminate the disabled, you shouldn't at least do that. So people frown at the idea of population control, especially when it comes to having to remove and eliminate people who are either poor or black or brown people. You know, we hear all of these things that it's been rejected. But it's really what they've done is that they've recycled this idea or this ideology. They have recycled it, put it through the washer. They have perfumed it with the good language and the nice language of progress and women empowerment, and you know, it would help you unlock potentials, as I heard in one TED Talk show that was done by the wife of Bill Gates. So they have this, you know, almost like a florid language that they've used to boost up this whole new idea that is actually an old and washed off idea. And now they've brought it back and they've made it the very core of a lot of the well-funded, extensive projects that we see in Africa now. Now, you mentioned China. People who have followed the situation in China as far as population control is concerned would know that the Chinese are now going through a very critical time when their population, we are seeing an imbalance within population, and you know, in terms of male and female, there is a great imbalance. They are seeing demographic winter happening in some parts of society. They are seeing the so-called upside down pyramid, where you have a child who has to take care of 2 parents and then who has to take care of 4 grandparents. There are all these things that we have seen. They've tried it. It failed in China. Of course, it failed in India, where there is a very serious problem of large numbers of girls being killed, the so-called femicide. They're killing unborn babies that are girls. Now they bring it to Africa, where our donors, all they see is the number of people being born in Africa, is the fertility rate of the African women, without even bothering to ask the Africans what they think or what they feel about their population, about family, how they conceive all of these things. Our donors are coming in with the same population control ideas that have been rejected, but only just wrapped up in a whole new campaign, and they are making it seem palatable, or they're making it seem like something good and something that is a mark of progress.